Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. This might be a slightly calmer podcast than usual because I'm not aware of any major disasters happening in the last 7 days, but there's still a fair bit of stuff going on. Now, there was a burst of publicity around AUKUS and a harmonising of export restrictions between the US, UK and Australia. You can read the usually hyperbolic release from Defence Minister Richard Marles. It was issued on August the 16th with the title, Generational Export Reforms to Boost AUKUS Trade and Collaboration. There's a lot to it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. From September 1st this year, AUKUS partners, it says, will operate in this new export license-free environment, significantly boosting defence trade and innovation. It will support unprecedented levels of advanced scientific, technological and industrial cooperation, fast-tracking the delivery of high-end capabilities to the Australian Defence Force. Now, part of that might be true, and I'll explain why in a moment. But of the many parts of it, one section really jumped out at me, where it says, the elimination of around 900 export permits required under the previous export controls from Australia to the US and UK, valued at $5 billion per year. $5 billion per year of exports from Australia, I'm going to call BS on that. That seems just totally impossible to me. It's actually a little bit hard to measure exports from Australia. There's very little record keeping going on about this. But if you look at bodies like the SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, they would estimate that Australia's defence exports are worth about 1/20th of that. I mean, we'd be lucky to be hitting 250 million a year, I would have thought. And by the way, that's also, if you like, confirmation from Australian industry. Exports are just really not that big a deal, and it's not even remotely approaching 5 billion a year in total, let alone to the US and the UK. Now, the US does buy some stuff from Australia, the F-35 program being an example, but the record of the UK is particularly woeful. They buy next to nothing from Australia. Now, the wording is also a bit ambiguous. I know what they mean, but it says eliminating the licence fees will save Australian companies $5 billion per year. No. The amount of licence fees that you would be paying on $5 billion, I don't know, but it would only be, again, a tiny fraction of that. So no matter how you look at it, this is total nonsense. And it's either a clerical error and a complete whopper at that, or far worse, it's the government lying to massively boost the perceived economic benefits to Australia of the AUKUS agreement. And in my mind, I wouldn't be surprised that this false information of 5 billion of annual sales is somehow meant to act as a counterweight to the gifts of almost 10 billion being made from Australia to US and UK submarine building companies. Now, if this is the case, maybe it's finally some indication that these ludicrous donations are somehow causing tiny flickers of concern in the defence system, maybe in the government, as more people realise just how much we are giving away and with no refunds possible. Purely coincidentally, at almost exactly the same time as the government was releasing this information, former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans was giving a speech at the ANU with the title, AUKUS, the worst defence and foreign policy decision our country has made. And I'll read you the opening paragraph so that you get a flavour of the whole thing. He says, Defence Minister Marles's love for the US is so dewy-eyed as to defy parody. Foreign Minister Wong is far more beady-eyed and instinctively wary of overcommitment to America's view of itself but has been unwilling to rock the boat. Politics played a significant part in the birth of AUKUS in Australia, and it goes on in that vein. Now, it's quite a long speech. I don't have time to cover it all in this episode, but I will do in the next one. Now, coming back to the ridiculous $5 billion worth of exports claim, I've written to the Department of Defence asking them to provide evidence of this, some sort of breakdown of the figure, and I've given them a deadline of 7 days from now. And in the unlikely event that I receive a reply, I will, of course, happily share it with all listeners. Now, the far greater possibility is the government will simply let this outlandish claim of annual exports sit there, happy to have created or furthered the impression that rather than being a $400 billion cost to Australian taxpayers, AUKUS in fact represents rivers of gold for all of the country. But returning to the substance of the announcement, as far as I can tell, the overwhelming beneficiary will be US industry, which is now even less constrained about what it can sell to Australia. The export license in the US is very slow. Companies tell me that they can have to wait for at least a year to be able to sell to Australia. The process now will become much faster. So, which is good for the US, but I'm not really sure about Australia. It's good for the ADF, faster delivery of capability. Now, since I've touched on nuclear-powered submarines, let me muse aloud again at performance differences between nuclear and conventional propulsion technology. Last time I tried to explain that merely detecting the submarine is only part of the equation, though a very important one, because the adversary then has to do something about the existence of the thing that they've detected. And to repeat very briefly, if a conventional submarine is detected, then when it is snorting to charge its diesels, once it is again fully submerged, it becomes extremely difficult to find, and with air-independent propulsion, it can remain fairly much impossible to detect for up to the next 20 days. That's a simplification, but it's worth thinking about. Now, nuclear submarines also come to the same proximity to the surface and also stick their various masts up into the air to gather data, be it via their periscopes. They usually have two, a search periscope and an attack periscope, and they have a separate ESM mast. So if the technology exists to detect the snort mast on a conventional submarine, it certainly exists to detect those masts on a nuclear boat. But today, I want to focus on another very much related issue, namely the operation of any form of crewed submarine in the South China Sea. We are told, very vaguely, and I certainly respect the need for operational information to remain unclassified, but we are told that extended operations in the South China Sea are vital for Australia's national interests. We are also told that conventional submarines can only remain on station for a much shorter time than a nuclear-powered boat because it takes them so much longer to transit there and back. That's absolutely true. If I had to guess, you might get 15 days on station with a conventional submarine sailing from HMAS Stirling in Western Australia. That's if you don't bother picking up any more diesel on the way, while a nuclear-powered submarine, leaving the same place, might get around 30 days on station. So think about that. We are basically paying many tens of billions of dollars more for an extra 15 days in the South China Sea per submarine. Now, again, I know it's not nearly as simple as that, and nuclear submarines do retain one very important advantage, namely the idea of being able to run away very fast if you are threatened. I'm not going to break any confidences here, but what I'm saying can be gathered by any reading of a Tom Clancy novel, which makes the government's blanket of secrecy, I think, completely ridiculous. So even if a submarine hasn't been detected beforehand during its transit to the South China Sea, it will certainly be picked up when it discharges its torpedoes. That's because even though the ocean is an extremely noisy place, certain brief noises such as the active discharge of a torpedo, are relatively easy to pick up. Now, think of it this way. Think of the ocean as being like a very busy restaurant with lots of people talking away happily and all sorts of kitchen noises in the background. Got that? Now, if someone drops a glass that shatters on the concrete floor, that instantly gets everyone's attention. We've all noticed that. All conversation pauses. Now, that's akin to what I've described with the discharge of a torpedo. So if a warship, or potentially several warships, detect that sound, all hell breaks loose because their number one priority is survival. All that they know is that there is one or more torpedoes in the water, and they have only a few minutes to react before they face the possibility of 250 kilograms of TNT exploding under the keel of the ship, breaking it in two, sinking it, and potentially killing everyone on board. The theory goes that the submarine that fired the torpedoes would not linger. It would travel as far away as possible, as quickly as possible, while the adversary is distracted dealing with the incoming attack. A conventional submarine can only travel at maximum speed, let's say, for about an hour before its battery pack starts to be depleted. That's different in the case of lithium-ion batteries, but let's not get too distracted here. With a nuclear submarine, you can keep the foot on the gas for days at a time, particularly if you don't care precisely where you are and you just want to reach deep water as fast as possible. But even here, it's not quite that simple. There are pros and cons. A conventional submarine with AIP won't be able to get away as fast as a nuke, but once the anti-submarine warfare effort has begun, it will be much quieter and therefore harder to detect than a nuclear submarine running away at maximum speed. But let's continue with perhaps the most important part of this, and the one that is most frequently overlooked, namely the benefit of being in the South China Sea in the first place. The simplest answer is often a submarine is most effective when it operates just outside an enemy port, either bottling up their fleet completely or sinking them when they venture out. And that's fine in theory, and in fact, there are practical examples from both the First and the Second World Wars that support the concept. But while it might be the best way to use a submarine, it isn't the only way. Let's look at a few examples. On March 26, 2010, a North Korean miniature submarine fired a single torpedo at the South Korean corvette Cheonan. It exploded under the ship, as it was designed to do, breaking it in two. It rapidly sunk with the tragic loss of 46 lives. The North Korean sub apparently calculated the probable location of the Cheonan, given the ship was participating in a large anti-submarine warfare exercise in the open sea near the disputed maritime boundary with the North. That attack wasn't outside Cheonan's home port. But I think an even better example is from the Falklands War in 1982. Many people have heard of the sinking by the British nuclear-powered submarine HMAS Conqueror of the aging Argentinian cruiser the Belgrano. It was actually sailing away from the Falklands and was in the open ocean when it was torpedoed. Less well known are the exploits of an Argentinian conventional submarine. The San Luis, an old German-designed 209 with a training crew on board. Most of the experienced officers at that time were back in Germany doing submarine training. It began, and I'm quoting now from a study into this by the US Naval Institute, so it's not just me rambling. It began the patrol with the intention of striking the British Naval Task Force north of the Falklands. During her one continuous patrol, she claimed 3 torpedo attacks against British shipping. The first engagement was on the 1st of May against HMS Yarmouth, a Type 12 frigate, and HMS Brilliant, a Type 22 frigate. The attack of the San Luis didn't result in any hits, but she was then subjected to an anti-submarine warfare battle that lasted for 20 hours with the British surface ships hunting and attacking the submarine. Apparently it survived numerous depth charge attacks and a torpedo attack. The San Luis managed to break contact and began her second run on the 8th of May, a week later, against, it says, a British submarine, but there's no record of that from the British side of things. Now, her final run was a further 2 days after that, on the 10th of May, against 2 more warships, firing torpedoes at HMS Arrow, a Type 21 frigate, and HMS Alacrity, also a Type 21. And after 6 minutes, a small explosion was heard on the frigate's bearing, and when it was all checked out, HMS Arrow retrieved her towed torpedo countermeasures system. It was evident that the countermeasures had been hit by the explosion. Now, analysts have concluded, and I think it's pretty obvious, that if the St. Louis had been commanded by an experienced crew, and if the attacks had succeeded, it might have changed the course of the Falklands War. A number of British warships would have been sunk, and while the submarine itself remained invulnerable. That's a bit of history, but let's talk about the future. In a war with China, the first priority of submarines will probably be the destruction of enemy warships and their submarines, but after that it would be to strangle the Chinese economy by targeting energy supplies, oil and gas, coming in mainly from the Middle East. But you wouldn't do that in the heavily defended South China Sea. It would be off places like the Straits of Hormuz, or off the southern tip of India, or in the Malacca Straits. And you don't need a nuclear-powered submarine for any of that. Now, let's finish up with a few words about the issue once again of being able to detect submarines. The more that I read and learn about what China is doing with the South China Sea, the clearer it comes that the area will soon be uninhabitable to crewed submarines. It will simply be too risky to send expensive assets and human beings in harm's way. China is putting in all the time more sonar arrays mounted on the sea floor. China has maritime patrol aircraft. China has satellites in low Earth orbit, keeping the area under constant attention. And that's today. This is 2024. So we have to extrapolate, well, the first of the second-hand Virginia-class submarines is said to arrive in 2032. So 8 years from now, if China's technology continues to develop as rapidly as it is, and the capabilities of the People's Liberation Army Navy continue to evolve so quickly, to me, it would be an extremely foolish act to send any submarine into that area at all, be it conventional or nuclear. There have also been related developments in artificial intelligence. When you apply that to your various filters, the ability to pick up and analyze sounds increases dramatically. And so I think in a relatively short period of time, the entire South China Sea will become a no-go area. And once you take that out of the equation, it seems to me that most of the justification for acquiring nuclear-powered submarines disappears. And I'll just conclude with that final note. I'm sorry if I'm laboring the point. There are plenty of very effective things to do that you can do with conventional submarines. You can sink enemy commercial traffic, but you can also sink enemy warships in the open ocean. Okay, it might be a little bit harder to do. It might not be ideal, but you can still do it. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.